The howling pierced through the darkness again, a haunting sound that had become James Mitchell's nightly torment. For 3 weeks straight, the same wolf had been appearing outside his remote cabin, its mournful cry echoing through the Montana wilderness like a plea for help. Tonight was different, though. The howling seemed closer, more urgent, almost human in its desperation. James sat in his worn leather armchair, a cup of lukewarm coffee trembling slightly in his weathered hands. At 52, he had moved to this isolated cabin 6 months ago, seeking escape from a life that had crumbled around him after his wife Sarah's death. The solitude had been his sanctuary until the wolf arrived. The creature would appear just after sunset, a massive grey shadow at the edge of the tree line. It would sit there, perfectly still, its amber eyes fixed on James's cabin before unleashing that soul-piercing howl. Local rangers had dismissed his concerns, telling him wolves rarely approached human dwellings unless attracted by food. But James knew this was different. This wolf wasn't hunting, it was waiting. Tonight, the wolf's cry carried an unprecedented urgency that made the hair on the back of James's neck stand up. Setting down his coffee cup with a shaky hand, he moved to the window. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. There it was again, the wolf, closer than ever before, its massive form clearly visible in the moonlight. What happened next would change everything. The wolf took several deliberate steps toward the cabin, then stopped, turned its head back toward the forest, and howled again. It repeated this sequence, like a dog trying to lead its master somewhere. James had seen this behavior before, in search and rescue dogs during his 20 years as a park ranger. "This is insane," James muttered to himself, reaching for his heavy coat and flashlight. Something inside him, an instinct he couldn't explain, told him he needed to follow. Maybe it was the isolation playing tricks on his mind, or perhaps it was the memory of how many times he'd seen animals display unexpected intelligence during his years in the wilderness. The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside. The wolf, seeing him emerge, grew visibly agitated, pacing back and forth, whining softly. As James approached, he expected the animal to flee or show aggression. Instead, it maintained its distance while continuing its strange beckoning behavior. "What is it, boy?" James called out, his voice carrying across the silent landscape. "What are you trying to show me?" The wolf responded with another howl, this one shorter, almost truncated, before taking several steps into the tree line. It stopped, looking back at James expectantly. 20 years of ranger experience screamed at him not to follow a wild animal into the forest at night. But something about this wolf's behavior, its deliberate actions, told him this wasn't just any wild animal. James clicked on his flashlight and took his first step into the forest. The wolf maintained a consistent distance, always staying just within sight, leading him deeper into the wilderness. The moonlight filtered through the bare branches, creating an eerie lattice of shadows on the snow-covered ground. As they moved deeper into the forest, James began to notice something odd about their path. The wolf wasn't taking random turns or following game trails. It was leading him in a specific direction, adjusting its pace to ensure James could keep up. This calculated behavior only reinforced his growing certainty that something extraordinary was happening. After about 15 minutes of walking, the wolf's behavior changed. It stopped, lowered its head, and let out a low whine. James swept his flashlight beam across the area, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, partially hidden behind a fallen log, was a blue backpack, a child's backpack. James's heart began to race. He knew these woods well enough to know that no child should be out here, especially not at night. The wolf whined again, more urgently this time, and continued forward. James followed, his mind racing through possibilities, each more concerning than the last. The sound of running water grew louder as they approached a steep ravine. James recognized this area. There was a treacherous series of drops leading down to Mason Creek below. The wolf led him to the edge of the ravine, and then did something that made James's jaw drop. It began carefully picking its way down a barely visible path along the ravine wall. "Dear God," James whispered as his flashlight beam revealed what lay about 20 feet below. There, on a narrow ledge, was a small figure huddled against the rock face, a child, motionless in the bitter cold. The wolf had been trying to save a life. For 3 weeks, it had been coming to his cabin, the closest human dwelling to this spot, trying to get help. The realization hit James like a physical blow, but there would be time for amazement later. Right now, that child needed help. As James carefully began his descent down the ravine wall, he couldn't help but wonder about the extraordinary series of events that had brought him here. The wolf watched from nearby, its amber eyes reflecting both intelligence and concern. This was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything James thought he knew about the natural world and the connections between all living things. James's ranger training kicked in as he assessed the situation. The child, a boy no more than 8 or 9, was wedged against the ravine wall, partially protected from the wind but dangerously exposed to the cold. His small body was curled into a tight ball, wearing a coat that was nowhere near warm enough for the Montana winter. "Hey there," James called out softly, trying to keep his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm here to help. Can you hear me?" The boy didn't respond. James carefully made his way down to the ledge, his boots finding precarious purchase on the icy rock face. Above them, the wolf paced anxiously, occasionally whining. As James reached the ledge, he could hear the boy's shallow breathing, alive but barely. With trembling fingers, James checked for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. The boy's skin was dangerously cold, but not yet showing signs of severe frostbite. James shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around the child, his own body immediately protesting against the bitter cold. "I'm going to get you out of here, son," James whispered, more to himself than the unconscious boy. The climb back up would be treacherous. He couldn't risk carrying the child on his back with such uncertain footing. He'd need help. James pulled out his phone, silently thanking Sarah for insisting he always carry it despite his preference for isolation. 1 bar of service, it would have to be enough. He dialed 911, his voice shaking as he explained the situation and location to the dispatcher. Help would come, but it would take time to reach them. While waiting, James held the boy close, trying to share what warmth he could. The wolf had settled on a ledge slightly above them, maintaining its vigilant watch. In the moonlight, James could now see details he'd missed before. The boy's clothes were dirty, but of good quality, his shoes barely scuffed. This wasn't a child from a homeless or transient family. Something else had brought him to these woods. "What's your story, little one?" James murmured, rubbing the boy's arms gently to promote circulation. "How did you end up out here?" The sound of distant sirens carried through the cold air about 20 minutes later. The wolf's ears perked up, but it didn't flee. James pulled out his flashlight and waved it back and forth, helping the rescue team locate them. The next hour was a blur of activity. Rescue ropes, a basket stretcher, emergency medical technicians speaking in clipped, professional tones. As they lifted the boy to safety, James caught a glimpse of his face in the harsh rescue lights. Something about those features tugged at his memory, but he couldn't place it. The wolf watched the entire rescue operation from a distance, only retreating into the shadows when the boy was safely in the ambulance. James rode with them to St. Peter's Hospital in Helena, unable to explain why he felt so strongly compelled to stay with this unknown child. Perhaps it was the memory of his own loss, or maybe it was the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Whatever the reason, he couldn't leave until he knew the boy would be okay. In the emergency room, the story began to unfold. The boy's name was Michael Turner, age 8. He had been missing for 3 days, last seen at a campground 20 miles away, where his father had taken him for a weekend trip. The father had reported him missing after he allegedly wandered away from their campsite. But something about the story didn't sit right with James. He had spent decades in these woods, taught countless families about camping safety. An experienced outdoorsman would never let a child wander far enough to get lost, especially not in winter. And why would a boy travel 20 miles from the campground? As James sat in the hospital waiting room, his body finally warming up, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. The wolf's behavior, the boy's location, the father's story. None of it added up to a simple case of getting lost in the woods. A police officer approached him, notebook in hand. "Mr. Mitchell," I need to ask you a few questions about how you found the boy. James nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the wolf, about its weeks of persistent attempts to get his attention. How had it known? Why had it chosen him? The officer's next words snapped him back to attention. "The boy's father is on his way," she said, making a note in her book. "Gerald Turner. Says he's been searching non-stop since Michael disappeared." The name hit James like a physical blow. Gerald Turner. Suddenly, he remembered where he had seen features similar to Michael's before, in a newspaper article from 3 years ago. A story about a woman's suspicious death in Bozeman, ruled an accident despite questions from the local community. The woman's name was Catherine Turner, and her husband Gerald had moved away shortly after her death, taking their young son with him. James felt his hands grow cold again, but not from the winter air. The wolf hadn't just led him to a lost child. It had led him to something much darker, a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. As he sat there in the sterile hospital waiting room, James realized that following the wolf into the forest had been just the beginning of a journey that would force him to confront not only another's darkness, but his own past as well. The sound of urgent footsteps in the hospital corridor told him that Gerald Turner had arrived. James stood up, his ranger training and years of experience reading people coming to the forefront. Whatever was really going on here, he had a feeling he was about to find out. Gerald Turner burst into the waiting room with the controlled urgency of a man who knew he was being watched. He was tall and well-dressed, despite the late hour, his graying hair perfectly combed. But there was something rehearsed about his concerned father act that made James's skin crawl. "Where is my son?" Gerald demanded at the nurse's station, his voice carrying the polished tone of someone used to giving orders. "I need to see Michael immediately." James watched from his corner of the waiting room, noticing how Gerald's eyes darted around the space, assessing everyone present. When their gazes met, something flickered across Gerald's face, recognition, then quickly masked concern. "Mr. Turner?" A doctor emerged from the treatment area, clutching a clipboard. "Your son is stable, but we've found some concerning injuries that we need to discuss." Gerald's posture stiffened. Injuries. He was lost in the woods for 3 days. Of course he has injuries. "These injuries predate his disappearance, Mr. Turner. Some appear to be weeks old, others months." The doctor's voice was professionally neutral, but her eyes were hard. "We're required by law to report any suspicious injuries in minors." James felt his suspicions solidifying into certainty. He thought about the wolf again, about its desperate attempts to lead someone, anyone, to that ravine. Had it somehow sensed the boy's vulnerability? Animals often showed uncanny ability to recognize suffering. A police detective arrived, asking to speak with Gerald privately. As they disappeared down the hallway, James made his way to Michael's room. The boy was awake now, small and pale against the white hospital sheets. His eyes widened when he saw James. "You're the man who found me," Michael said softly. His voice was hoarse, but there was intelligence in his gaze. "Was there really a wolf?" James sat in the chair beside the bed. "Yes, there was. A very special wolf that wanted to make sure you were safe." He hesitated, then added, "Can you tell me how you ended up in that ravine, Michael?" The boy's hands twisted in the blanket. "Dad says I'm not supposed to talk about our camping trips." "What about your mum?" James asked gently. "Would she want you to talk about it?" Tears welled up in Michael's eyes. "Mom's gone. Dad says it was an accident, that she fell down the stairs. But—" he trailed off, looking fearfully at the door. "But what, Michael?" "She didn't fall," the boy whispered. "She was trying to take me away, to go live with Aunt Claire. Dad found out, and—" A sob caught in his throat. James felt a cold rage building inside him, the kind he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. "The camping trip wasn't really a camping trip, was it?" Michael shook his head. "I heard him on the phone. He said we might need to move again, that people were asking questions. I got scared. When he was setting up the tent, I ran. I just ran and ran until I couldn't anymore." "And then you fell." "No," Michael said, his voice dropping even lower. "Dad found me. He was so angry. He said if I was going to run away, I might as well—" The boy couldn't finish the sentence. James understood with horrifying clarity. Gerald hadn't lost his son in the woods. He had left him there to die, making it look like a tragic accident, just like Catherine's death 3 years ago. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Michael tense. Before anyone could enter, James quickly squeezed the boy's hand. "You're safe now, I promise." Gerald returned with the detective and a social worker. His composed facade showed traces of strain. "Michael, thank God you're all right. And when you wandered off, I was so worried." "Mr. Turner," the detective interrupted, "we've received some information from the Bozeman Police Department about your wife's death. They're reopening the investigation." Gerald's face hardened. "That case was closed years ago. My son needs rest, not more trauma from dredging up the past." "Dad," Michael's voice was surprisingly strong, "tell them about Mom. Tell them what really happened." The atmosphere in the room grew thick with tension. Gerald took a step toward the bed, but James stood up, placing himself between father and son. In that moment, he saw something in Gerald's eyes that chilled him, the same cold calculation he'd seen in predators during his years in the wilderness. But Gerald Turner wasn't in his element here. He was surrounded by witnesses, his carefully constructed narrative beginning to unravel. The detective must have seen something in his expression too, because she moved closer, her hand near her weapon. "Gerald Turner," she said firmly, "we need you to come with us to answer some questions." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Gerald spun around, shoving past the social worker and bolting for the door. The detective reacted instantly, racing after him with a call for backup on her radio. James stayed with Michael, who had begun to tremble. "It's okay," James assured him, though his heart was racing. "They'll catch him." Outside the window, a familiar howl echoed through the night. The wolf was still there, still watching, still protecting. Michael heard it too. And for the first time since James had found him, the boy smiled. "When I was in the ravine," he said quietly, "that wolf stayed with me. It kept me warm and made me feel safe, like Mom used to do." James felt tears prick at his eyes. He thought about Sarah, about how she had always believed that love could bridge any distance, even death. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps love could take many forms, even the unlikely guardian angel of a grey wolf in the Montana wilderness. The hospital corridors erupted into chaos as security guards and police officers rushed past Michael's room. James could hear radio chatter and the sound of running feet echoing through the building. Gerald Turner, it seemed, was not going quietly. "I want to help them find him," Michael said suddenly, sitting up straighter in his hospital bed. "I know things about Dad, about where he might go." James studied the boy's face, seeing not fear, but determination. It reminded him of Sarah's expression when she'd fought her illness, fierce, unwavering courage in the face of darkness. "Tell me," he said, pulling out his phone to take notes. "There's an old hunting cabin," Michael began, his voice growing stronger. "Dad took me there once before—" He swallowed hard. "Before Mom died. It's where he said we'd go if things ever got bad. He has supplies there, money too." James immediately called the detective who had been questioning Gerald. As he relayed the information, he could hear the strain in her voice. Gerald had managed to get to his car and escape the hospital parking lot. They had patrols searching, but in the vast Montana wilderness, he could be anywhere. "The cabin," Michael continued after James hung up. "It's near Crystal Lake, but not on any maps. Dad said that's what made it perfect." James felt his ranger instincts kick in. He knew that area. It was remote, but not impossible to reach. More importantly, he knew all the old logging roads and game trails that someone could use to get there undetected. The detective, Linda Martinez, returned to the room slightly out of breath. "We've got roadblocks set up, but no sign of him yet." She turned to Michael. "Can you tell me more about this cabin?" As Michael described the location in detail, James noticed something outside the window. The wolf had emerged from the tree line near the hospital, its grey form visible under the parking lot lights. It was pacing, agitated, as if it sensed the tension in the air. Detective Martinez was already coordinating with her team, calling in the location and organizing search parties. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, turning to James, "given your experience in these woods, we could use your help." James looked at Michael, reluctant to leave him alone. The social worker, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "I'll stay with him," she assured them. "He won't be alone." "The wolf," Michael said suddenly, grabbing James's hand. "It'll help you find him. It's been watching over me all this time." James squeezed the boy's hand, amazed by his resilience. "Get some rest, Michael. We'll handle this." Outside, the night had grown colder. The wolf was still there, watching as James and Detective Martinez emerged from the hospital. Other officers were gearing up, checking equipment and reviewing maps. "That's the wolf you mentioned in your statement?" Martinez asked, eyeing the animal with a mix of wariness and wonder. "The one that led you to Michael?" "Yes," James replied, watching as the wolf began moving toward the tree line, stopping to look back at them. "And I think it wants us to follow again." Martinez raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know that sometimes you had to trust instincts that defied explanation. "We've got units heading to all possible routes to Crystal Lake," she said, checking her phone. "But if there's a faster way—" The wolf howled, the sound carrying across the parking lot like a call to action. James felt it in his bones, the same pull he'd experienced earlier that night. "There is," he said. "But we'll need to go on foot part of the way. I know these woods, and I'm betting that wolf does too." They gathered a small team, James and Martinez and 2 other officers experienced in wilderness operations. As they set out in one of the patrol cars, following James's directions to an old logging road, the wolf kept pace alongside them in the woods, visible in flashes between the trees. "I've never seen anything like it," one of the officers muttered. "It's like it understands what we're doing." James thought about Michael in the ravine, about how the wolf had stayed with him, kept him warm, protected him. There was something profound in that connection, something that went beyond ordinary animal behavior, without crossing into the impossible. The logging road ended at a fallen tree, but James knew they were close. The wolf appeared again, more urgent now, leading them along a nearly invisible trail. They moved as quietly as possible, using hand signals to communicate. After about 15 minutes, James spotted a faint light through the trees. The cabin, Martinez signaled the team to spread out, their movements precise and practiced. The wolf had disappeared, but James could sense its presence nearby, watching. Through his binoculars, James could see Gerald Turner inside the cabin, hastily shoving items into a bag. The man's composed facade had crumbled, replaced by desperate, jerky movements. He was trapped, and he knew it. Martinez keyed her radio, speaking in a whisper. "Target confirmed. All units move in. Remember, he's considered dangerous." As they closed in on the cabin, James thought about Michael, about Sarah, about all the lives torn apart by violence and secrets. The wolf's howl had led him here, not once but twice, as if guided by some higher purpose. Not magic, not supernatural intervention, but something equally powerful. The deep, primal connection between all living things, the universal desire to protect the innocent. The next few moments would determine not just Gerald Turner's fate, but Michael's future. As the officers moved into position, James saw the wolf one last time, standing on a ridge overlooking the cabin, its presence a reminder that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected sources. The standoff at the cabin lasted only minutes, but to James it felt like hours. Gerald Turner, cornered and desperate, initially refused to come out. Through the cabin's windows, they could see him pacing, his earlier composure completely shattered. "Gerald Turner," Detective Martinez's voice cut through the night air. "The cabin is surrounded. Come out with your hands up." For a moment, there was only silence. Then the cabin door creaked open, and Gerald emerged, a gun trembling in his hand. His eyes were wild, darting between the officers positioned around the clearing. When his gaze met James's, there was a flicker of recognition, followed by pure hatred. "You don't understand," Gerald called out, his voice cracking. "I protected him. Everything I did was to protect him." "Like you protected Catherine?" James couldn't help but ask, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Your wife wasn't trying to hurt Michael. She was trying to save him from you." Gerald's face contorted. "She was going to take him away. I couldn't let her." A low growl echoed through the clearing. The wolf had appeared at the edge of the tree line, its presence drawing Gerald's attention. In that moment of distraction, Martinez and her team moved in. The gun clattered to the ground, and Gerald Turner, the man who had terrorized his family for years, fell to his knees, broken at last. As the officers led Gerald away in handcuffs, James noticed something change in the wolf's demeanor. It stood watching the scene, but its previous urgency was gone. Instead, there was an almost peaceful quality to its stance, as if its task was complete. Back at the hospital, Michael was still awake, waiting. When James entered the room, the boy's eyes immediately asked the question he couldn't voice. "They got him," James said gently, sitting beside the bed. "He can't hurt you anymore." Michael's shoulders sagged with relief, tears streaming down his face. "What happens now?" "Your Aunt Claire is on her way from Oregon," the social worker informed them. "She's been searching for you and your father ever since your mother's death. She never stopped looking." James watched as hope bloomed on Michael's face. "Mom always said Aunt Claire was the strongest person she knew," the boy whispered. Over the next few days, as Michael recovered and the legal proceedings began, James found himself returning to the hospital regularly. He brought books about wolves, sharing them with Michael, who was fascinated by the creature that had saved his life. They talked about courage, about survival, and sometimes about loss. "I miss Mom," Michael confided one afternoon, looking out the window where snow was falling softly. "Sometimes I think she sent the wolf to watch over me," James thought carefully before responding. "I don't know if that's how it works," he said honestly. "But I do know that love leaves marks on the world. Your mum loved you so much that maybe that love attracted something good when you needed it most." Claire Matthews arrived the next day, a tall woman with Catherine's kind eyes and determined chin. The moment she saw Michael, she burst into tears, gathering him in her arms. "I never stopped looking," she whispered. "Never." As the days turned into weeks, the story of the wolf and the boy became something of a local legend. Gerald Turner confessed to his crimes, including Catherine's murder, ensuring he would never hurt his family again. Michael and Claire began the process of healing, building a new life together in Oregon. James found himself changed as well. The isolation he had sought after Sarah's death no longer felt like a refuge. Instead, he started working with local wildlife conservation groups, using his ranger experience to protect the creatures that shared his beloved wilderness. The wolf appeared one last time, about a month after everything had happened. James was sitting on his cabin porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunset when he saw it at the tree line. Their eyes met across the clearing, and James felt a deep sense of understanding pass between them. "Thank you," he said softly, though he knew the wolf couldn't understand the words. But perhaps it understood something else. The connection between all living things, the way life finds ways to protect itself, to endure and grow despite the darkness. The wolf turned and disappeared into the forest, but its legacy remained. In the years that followed, James would receive occasional letters from Michael and Claire, updates about school, about healing, about building a new life. They had adopted a rescue dog, Michael wrote, a grey-furred mutt with gentle eyes that reminded him of his protector in the woods. James kept working in the wilderness he loved, but now with a different perspective. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full, he would hear a wolf's howl in the distance and remember how a single animal's determination had unraveled a web of secrets and saved a young boy's life. He never saw that particular wolf again, but he didn't need to. Its purpose had been fulfilled, not through any supernatural intervention, but through the simple, profound connection between all living things, the universal instinct to protect, to survive, to help others survive. In the end, it wasn't about magic or miracles. It was about connection, courage, and the extraordinary things that can happen when we listen to the calls for help around us, whether they come from a human voice or a wolf's howl in the night. 5 years later, the Montana autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson as James pulled up to the small airport in Helena. His truck, now showing signs of age much like himself, carried a handmade wooden box in the passenger seat, a gift he'd spent months crafting. Michael was 13 now, flying in from Oregon with Claire for their annual visit. They'd started this tradition 4 years ago, spending 2 weeks each fall in Montana. It was their way of acknowledging both the darkness and light that this place held for them. James spotted them immediately at baggage claim. Michael had grown tall, his face losing its childhood roundness, but his eyes still held that same quiet strength. When he saw James, his face broke into a wide smile. "Uncle James!" The boy, now teenager, rushed forward to embrace him. Claire followed with a warm hug of her own. "Oh, you've grown another foot since summer," James observed, handing Michael the wooden box. "This is for your collection." Michael opened it carefully, revealing an intricately carved wolf figure. James had captured every detail, from the watchful eyes to the protective stance. "It looks just like him," Michael whispered, running his fingers over the smooth wood. The drive to James's cabin was filled with updates. Michael was excelling in school, particularly in biology. He'd joined a wildlife conservation club and was already talking about studying veterinary medicine in college. His rescue dog, Shadow, had helped him through countless therapy sessions, becoming an unofficial therapy dog for other trauma survivors. Claire had transformed too. She'd started a foundation in Catherine's name, helping families affected by domestic violence escape and rebuild their lives. The foundation worked closely with wilderness therapy programs, using nature's healing power to help survivors recover. The prosecutor called last week, Claire mentioned, as they turned onto the familiar forest road. Gerald's appeal was denied. "He's serving his full sentence." James nodded, relief washing over him. Gerald Turner's attempts to manipulate the system had failed, justice holding firm like the mountains around them. The cabin came into view, but it wasn't the isolated refuge it had once been. James had made changes over the years, adding a guest room and a small office where he now worked remotely as a consultant for wildlife conservation programs. Photos lined the walls, Michael and Claire at various ages, newspaper clippings about the foundation, and one particular image that a wildlife photographer had captured by pure chance. A grey wolf standing sentinel on a ridge, backlit by a full moon. That evening, as they sat on the expanded porch watching the sunset, Michael asked the question he always asked during these visits. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" James smiled, remembering all the times they'd discussed this. "The rangers say there's still a grey wolf that patrols this territory, larger than average, they say, and unusually tolerant of human presence from a distance. They've even used him as an example in their studies of wolf behavior and intelligence." Michael nodded, clutching the wooden carving. "Sometimes I dream about those nights in the ravine, but it's not scary anymore. I just remember feeling safe, even in the cold. The wolf would press against me, sharing its warmth, watching over me. I used to think it was Mom somehow, but now I think—" He paused, searching for words. "Now I think it was just something extraordinary but natural, like how Shadow knows when I'm having a bad day before I do, or how Claire knew deep down that she'd find me someday. There's something powerful about that kind of connection, isn't it?" James thought about Sarah then, about how losing her had led him to isolation, and how a wolf's howl had pulled him back into the world. "Yes," he agreed. "Those connections are what make life worth living." A howl echoed through the valley, distant but clear. They all fell silent, listening. It might have been their wolf, or perhaps one of its descendants. It didn't really matter. The sound itself was enough, a reminder of that incredible winter night when an animal's determination had changed so many lives. The foundation Claire ran had recently opened a new shelter in Bozeman. They'd named it Wolf's Watch, and its logo was a simple silhouette of a wolf against a full moon. The shelter had already helped dozens of families find safety and rebuild their lives. Each family received a small wolf carving, similar to the one James had made for Michael, as a symbol of protection and hope. Later that night, after Michael had gone to bed, Claire and James sat talking by the fireplace. "He's healing so well," Claire said, pride evident in her voice. "The therapist says his way of processing trauma is remarkable. He's taken something terrible and turned it into a force for good." James thought about his own journey, how he'd emerged from grief not back to his old self, but to someone new. Someone who understood that healing often came through helping others heal. "The Foundation's wilderness program is expanding," Claire continued. "We're partnering with wolf sanctuaries now, Something about these animals just connects with the survivors. Maybe because wolves understand family, protection, survival. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant sounds of the forest. Tomorrow, they would hike to the ravine, a pilgrimage they made each visit. The place had transformed in their minds from a site of trauma to a monument of survival. Local hikers sometimes reported seeing a wolf there, watching over the trail as if standing guard. Life had a way of coming full circle, James reflected. His search for isolation had led him to connection. Michael's darkest moment had become the catalyst for helping others find light. A wolf's inexplicable behavior had reminded them all that some bonds transcended understanding but not belief. The wooden wolf carving sat on the mantel, its carved eyes reflecting the firelight. Outside, another howl echoed through the night, closer this time, familiar and comforting. They didn't need to look outside to know that somewhere in the vast Montana wilderness, under the same stars that had witnessed so much, a gray wolf was still patrolling, still watching, still reminding them that in nature's vast web of life, none of us are ever truly alone. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.